Great. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third Crowley lecture for this 2021 year, and our first for the new year. I'm John Quinn. I'm filling in for Mike Slane, our distinguished president. Mike's under the weather, but he sends his regards out to everyone, and he plans to be back for next month's lecture. So Ann Arnold, who's been doing all this behind the scenes work, said we have a very large number of participants here. We're excited about that. She said some people who've registered are not members. So if you're not a member, you can check out our website and sign up if you want to. And that'll get you on the mailing list for future lectures, some musical events, steak fries, all kinds of fun stuff. And speaking of lectures, we got one planned in March. Another in April. In March, we have Chuck Arning, a National Park Service ranger. His title is, "How Hard Would It Be to Dig a Ditch Anyhow? How the Irish Saved the Blackstone Canal." It's on March 16th, so you can hear that talk, and that'll get you all ready for St. Patrick's Day. Then on April 12th, Janet Nolan, who's spoken at the museum before, is going to talk about her research into her Irish roots. Her title is going to be "When Harry Met Mary Ann, the Saga of an Irish Family in America." I like these titles. I think they're going to be entertaining talks. So you can put those events on your calendar if you want. Both are still going to be virtual. We're virtual at least till April. We'll see how things go after that. But tonight's lecture, for that, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Erik Chaput, who teaches history at Lawrenceville Academy in New Jersey. He also teaches history in Providence College's continuing education school. Now, Erik is a really prolific scholar, so I have to be selective in telling you what he's published, or else I would eat up all the time. Erik's a native Rhode Islander. He's from North Providence. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in history from Providence College. He has a PhD from Syracuse University. He's an expert on the Dorr Rebellion, and I think I'd say the expert on the Dorr Rebellion. He has a book published on it with University of Kansas Press called "The People's Martyr, Thomas Wilson Dorr and His 1842 Rhode Island Rebellion." The book received high praise from journals, from scholars. Just one example, Gordon Wood from Brown University really gave it a rave review. In addition to his book, Erik's published articles in a wide array of journals, including Newport History, Rhode Island History, the New England Quarterly. And I'm thinking many people are probably familiar with Erik for his Providence Journal contributions. He writes book reviews and essays for the Projo. So I bet some people have seen him there. And if that weren't enough, Erik also manages a website on the Dorr Rebellion, and the website is housed at the Providence College Library. It's got letters, it's videos, all sorts of things, and it's open access, so you don't have to be connected to Providence College to be able to look through it. Now tonight, Erik said he's happy to take questions at the end, and we're going to use the chat function for that. So, and you can ask, you can put a question into the chat at any time as Erik's talking. We ask you to put your name in, and that way Erik's going to be able to identify you at the end when he answers your question. So without any further ado, we want to welcome Dr. Erik Chaput for his presentation, "Politics, Bigotry, and Nativism, Rhode Island's Catholic Irish in the 1842 Dorr Rebellion." Welcome, Erik.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. It's absolutely wonderful to be with you all here tonight. I wish I could do this in person in Rhode Island, but I thank you for allowing me to interrupt your dinner this evening and to have an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about the Dorr Rebellion. I want to thank John once again for that lovely introduction, and also to Ann for inviting me and to introducing me to your wonderful organization. And I do hope for those that are on the call that are not official members, please consider joining. They really do tremendous work, as I've been learning a bit about over the last several weeks. So once again, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge a man who's on this call that I wasn't sure if you would arrive tonight, but special hello and welcome to Father Robert Heyman, who was my professor and advisor at Providence College many years ago, and was the first person to turn me on to the Dorr Rebellion and to really encourage me to go to graduate school and to be a teacher. So to Father Heyman, thank you very much. I never really had a chance to say thank you, and now I get a public forum to do so. So it's wonderful to have you with us tonight. Certainly, I've been thinking a lot about ethnic history, obviously, as having an opportunity to talk with you. I will say I'm happy to take questions again, as John mentions at the end of the talk. And maybe to think a little bit about one thing that's been on my mind, I know John has written a little bit about, and so is Father Heyman, is where this fits in, I think, in large part when we think about issues of nativism and party political formation and structure in the 19th century. It was in vogue in the 1970s and 80s for scholars to really think deeply about it, and actually it's drifted off a little bit. We think about the origins of a party we know well, that is Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party. So maybe we can even touch upon that later tonight. Just on a quick family note, my great-great-great-grandfather, John Parnell, was transported to Australia, a trip he didn't really want to take, in 1834. My great-grandmother, Catherine Ward, was a Meehan, and she was from County Mahogany and came to America in the late 1800s at the age of 12 to join her sister in Pawtucket. So it's my Irish roots go back pretty far. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some images that I would like to use with my talk tonight. Classic image that you may have seen before of Thomas Dorr. And away we go. In June 1844, in the upper chambers of the Colony House in Newport's famed Washington Square, Thomas Wilson Dorr stood trial for treason. 2 years earlier, Dorr forcibly tried to implement the People's Constitution, a document under which he was elected governor, and that he believed had replaced the antiquated colonial charter from 1663. Prior to Dorr's election as the People's Governor in April of 1842, Chief Justice Job Durfee, who hailed from Tiverton, had departed from the rules of judicial propriety and toured the state, speaking out against the People's Constitution. Now Durfee, a Tiverton native, had the responsibilities of presiding over a trial that could very well end with a trip to the gallows for Dorr. Dorr was on trial facing the judge that just weeks before had sentenced the Irish immigrant John Gordon to the gallows for the murder of Amasa Sprague, a wealthy Cranston industrialist. Actually, I had an interesting opportunity to go on NPR a few weeks ago to talk about the Gordon trial. And I can put that link in the chat because it's a podcast. Dorr was well acquainted with Job Durfee. In the 1830s, he appeared before him numerous times as an attorney in very high-profile cases, including a previously, at least unknown in the scholarly community, a murder trial that Dorr was involved in. He surely knew that his chances of walking out of the courtroom a free man were not good. There is little room for doubt about the strength of Dorr's conviction that citizens had the right to alter or abolish their frame of government. According to Dorr, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the success of the revolution itself meant that the right to revolution was an inherent right in the people, which they could at all times peacefully exercise. It mattered little, however, for Chief Justice Durfee's charge to the jury left no room for debate. Quoting here from Durfee, "It may be, gentlemen, that he really believed himself to be the governor of this state, and that he acted throughout under this delusion," said Durfee. "However, it is no defense to an indictment for the violation of any law for the defendant to come to court and say, 'I thought that I was but exercising a constitutional right, and I claim an acquittal on the ground of a mistake.'" Durfee said there was no doubt that Dorr's actions constituted a levying of war. Dorr was duly found guilty and sent to Providence by ferry on June 27th, 1844, where he entered the new state prison on the Cove, a structure that he himself, ironically, had a hand in generating state funds to build in the 1830s while serving in the state legislature. I think it is important to point out early on that in our talk here tonight, that the citizens of Newport County played a significant role in both the origins and the course of Rhode Island's crisis in constitutionalism. Duty Pierce, one of Dorr's closest political allies, was a prominent Newport attorney, former U.S. congressman, and former state attorney general. His papers are held at the Newport Historical Society, and I had the pleasure, thanks to Bert at the Newport Historical Society, to go through them. Bert Lippincott. Newport Representative Richard K. Randolph played a crucial role in derailing Dorr's hopes of garnering federal support for his cause. The Virginia-born Randolph was married to Newporter Ann Lyman. Newport's sizable militia was also at the ready to board the ferry to Providence to put down Dorr's militia units at a moment's notice. But we're here tonight to learn a bit more about a man who was referred to as his siblings affectionately as Wilson. So who was this man? Born into wealth and privilege in 1805, Thomas Dorr seemed as a young man destined to take his place among Rhode Island's upper echelon. He studied at Phillips Exeter Academy, a school, as John mentioned a few moments ago, that resembles where I work here at Lawrenceville. Then he went on to Harvard and then studied at Columbia Law. It seemed that he was destined to lead a life of genuinely leisure and civic pursuits. Dorr would certainly earn his place in the history books, though it was not quite in the way, I would say, his father, Sullivan, depicted here, and his mother, Lydia, had hoped. In the eyes of the city's elite, the 36-year-old Dorr was a sanctimonious, deluded demagogue bent on destruction. Let me read a portion of a letter Lydia wrote to her son at the height of the crisis in spring of 1842. Quote, "It grieves us to the heart to know that a son of ours, arrived at so mature an age and so well versed in the laws of his country, should be a participant in acts calculated to bring the state into destruction, arouse passions which you cannot allay, and which, God forbid, produce civil strife attended with bloodshed and murder. We beseech you, we pray you to pause before you pass the Rubicon and become engulfed in political criminal degradation, where our feeble prayers will not avail to save you from disgrace and ruin." Dorr's parents certainly wanted him to stand down. As you all know, he did not. That's his home where he grew up, and indeed where he would die. So why Rhode Island? Why 1842? And why Thomas Dorr? The origins of what has become known as Dorr's Rebellion lay deep in the state's history. The political culture of Rhode Island was certainly unique. Democracy flourished in Rhode Island under the 1663 colonial charter granted by King Charles II. However, restrictive franchise clauses based on stringent property qualifications prevented new waves of immigrants, mostly Irish Catholics, in the 1820s and 1830s from entering the body politic. The charter restricted suffrage to those men possessing real estate, figure that was actually set in the year 1798 at $134, thereby disenfranchising most of the population from the commercial and manufacturing districts who were renting their dwellings. The election of 1840, for those that have studied this period of Rhode Island history, had a tremendous role in kind of sparking a conversation about suffrage. Huge rallies were connected to that presidential election that spilled into the following year. And on screen, I have some ribbons that are from the collection of a good friend of mine, Russell D. Simone, who lives in Middletown. Here's one from July of 41. "The people are the sovereign power. We will have our rights." Here's another one a little bit earlier, same year though. This is from April of 1842. "I am American citizen." And this one back again to 1841. "I am for a constitution and equal rights." The rise of a stable two-party system in the Jacksonian period led to increased efforts by political parties to seek out groups of people that had been previously locked out of the political process. Workers, laborers, abolitionists, women's rights advocates began using the Declaration to justify their quest for equality and their opposition to tyranny. As to why Dorr emerged as the intellectual spokesman of the common man, he was indeed the preeminent reformer in his state at the time. In the economic realm, he drafted a major piece of legislation that provided for government regulation of state-chartered banks. He worked for the abolishment of imprisonment for debt. He was an ardent abolitionist and anti-slavery advocate, serving on the executive committee of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society. He was also a leading educational reformer, pioneering the construction of the state's first high school. As I mentioned a moment ago, he also dealt in prison reform. By the end of 1841, Dorr had become the leading figure within what was known as the Rhode Island Suffrage Association. And indeed, over a three-day period in December 1841, an overwhelming majority of Rhode Islanders, almost 14,000 in favor, with just 52 opposed, cast ballots for something called the People's Constitution. Referring to the Suffrage Association and its intellectual spokesman, Thomas Wilson Dorr, Elijah Potter, a lawyer from South Kingstown, had this to say. Potter, and I quote here, said, "He who has raised the storm may not be able to govern it." Potter proclaimed his affinity for what he called the old system under the charter that granted a disproportionate amount of power to the agrarian areas of the state. But he recognized that the democratic tide that was sweeping the state could not be turned back. It is probably settled that we must have free suffrage, but in what way must it be brought about, asked Potter. For Potter, in order for constitutional change to be legal, it had to come from the sitting General Assembly and not an extra legal convention, that is the one that Dorr himself was involved in. As you get into the spring of 1842, there were two governments in Rhode Island, one claiming legitimacy under a colonial charter that prescribed no mode for amendment, the other claiming legitimacy from a constitution adopted by the majority of the citizens, an extra-legal plebiscite. Thomas Dorr was elected the people's governor on April 18th, 1842. On April 20th, Samuel Ward King from Johnston was elected to his fourth term in office. For those of you who like to have fun with Photoshop when you're doing PowerPoint presentations for your students, I always thought he looked a little bit like Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones. I do that just to have fun with my kids sometimes. Joshua Rathburn, a resident of Tiverton, informed Dorr that the majority of businessmen would do anything and everything rather than recognize the right of the people at large to make and alter their government at will. Rathburn also outlined the nativist strategy that the law and order advocates were developing. When Dorr attempted to enfranchise the sizable Irish immigrant population with more liberal suffrage provisions for, albeit white males, in the People's Constitution, an epidemic of nativism infected the state. The right, and I'm quoting here, to exclude naturalized citizens is strongly insisted and has perhaps operated against us more than anything else, noted the astute Rathburn. Men were called upon not to vote for a constitution, but to vote against Irishmen. To support the laws, prevent the Civil War, and vote down the Irishmen was the war cry, Rathburn told Dorr, of all of his opponents. A broadside warned Rhode Island citizens that the People's Constitution would, quote, place your government, your civil and political institutions, your public schools, and perhaps your religious privileges under the control of the Pope through the medium of thousands of naturalized foreign Catholics. The nativist fear centered on Roman Catholic priests. We're not, though, the exclusive province, as you might imagine, of affluent male conservatives. And summing up the difference between the two constitutions under debate at that point in the state, Aurelia Moffat, the wife of Orson Moffat, a Providence stable keeper, wrote in her diary that the greatest difference between the two documents is that foreigners are admitted to the affairs of the state almost unconditionally in the People's Constitution, and by the other, not till they can be supposed to have some interest in its welfare. Moffat believed that by the free suffrage advocates, we should be delivered up to the tender mercies of Roman Catholic foreigners who could be bought and sold by their employers and were at the beck and call of their priests. The anti-Dorrite Providence Journal utilized the acid pen of editor Henry Bowen Anthony to succinctly state its case against the People's Constitution in almost every issue. In comparing the two constitutions and offering a view on the superiority of what was known as the landholders document, Anthony argued, where will the balance be under Dorr? Where but among 2,500 foreigners and hundreds more who will be imported, their priest leaders will say to the political party, give us by law every opportunity to perpetuation our spiritual despotism. At the end of my talk tonight, I'm going to put into the chat feature a couple of links where you can read a little bit more about some constitutions that were actually operating in 1842 up for debate. There's actually 3 total in that 1 year, and I'll put them into the chat so you can see. Rhoda Newcomb, a Providence resident who watched Dorr's inaugural procession go by her home on the east side of the city, informed her son, Charles Newcomb, a border at George Ripley's utopian experiment in Brook Farm that you might have heard of before, that open warfare was on the horizon. Ripley actually had been Dorr's classmate at Harvard. Rhoda Newcomb viewed Dorr's inauguration as an impending apocalypse, an evil permitted by divine providence in order to cleanse the state of its sins. While certainly a sizable crowd, the parade accompanying Dorr on May 3 did not compare with the crowds, though, that attended rallies in April, May, and June of the previous year when the Suffrage Association was first getting going. One reason is that the support from the middle class who had once joined ranks with the mechanics and artisans in support of the People's Constitution began to erode as you get into 1842. They were afraid of arrest. Local merchants loyal to the Suffrage Association were threatened. Quote, screws were at times put on them without mercy. Landlords turned tenants out of their homes, along with discharging men from employment for bearing arms in defense of the people's rights. I was quoting there from a letter written to Dorr in May of 1842. The nativist attacks emanating from the law and order officials also once again served to curtail Dorr's support, and the intensity of the attacks had escalated greatly from the early spring. Every Roman Catholic Irishman is a Dorrite, proclaimed one widely reproduced broadside. The intensity of the nativist attacks had escalated greatly, as I said, over time, and all centering on the Irish immigrant flock. In early May of 1842, Elijah Porter Jr. noted to his friend, the former governor, John Brown Francis, that he had received a report of some importance on the local Catholic population. Father John Corey, one of the two priests stationed in Providence, had interfered to prevent the Irish from arming in the suffrage cause. 2 days later, Francis informed Porter that his Irishman Patrick, who was boiling over with fight, told him that James Fenwick, the Bishop of Boston, had put an injunction upon Rhode Island Catholics and that the measure would be obeyed. Bishop Fenwick strenuously urged Catholics not to support Dorr's reform efforts. As was the case with abolitionism, since Catholics were a minority everywhere, and a suspect minority at that, supporting controversial causes such as an extra-legal constitution might incur the wrath down upon them. Ironically, Dorr's uncle is one of the family members he was closest to, Philip Allen, a future governor, employed nearly 300 Irish Catholic workers at his print works in Providence and had intimate connections with that community. Indeed, as you look at the arrest records, as I learned from Russell DeSimone and Bob Heyman and Ray McKenna, who I think is on the call tonight, there was only one arrest, an Irish Protestant from Derry named David Hamilton, when you look at something that's known as the Burke Report that was produced later by Congress about the events in Rhode Island. And you can see the names of all those. They're also printed in the Providence Journal. On May 4th, 1842, the charter government declared what was painfully obvious to most Rhode Island residents: a state of insurrection existed. The General Assembly made a formal request to President Tyler to interpose the authority and power of the United States government to suppress such insurrection and lawless assembly. Taking every precaution, Samuel Ward King also wrote to the governor of Massachusetts, John Davis, asking him to have the state's forces stand at the ready at the border. Weeks later, Dorr's uncle, Zachariah Allen Jr., took it upon himself to go to Boston to orchestrate an arms deal with the Massachusetts Adjutant General. On May 4th, King also celebrated, once again, his fourth inaugural as governor under the Royal Charter. Dorr, taking the advice of the Democratic senators in Washington, who wrote to him fairly consistently during this period, was careful yet not to do anything that would spark violence. In writing my book on Dorr, I was struck by how each side remained true in this period in the spring of 1842 to its core values it claimed to be fighting for. There was indeed little room in the middle. It was the coercive power of a recalcitrant state legislature against the potency of the revolutionary doctrine of popular sovereignty. History seldom provides pure embodiments of such contrasting political alternatives, but in Rhode Island, they were both on display, and the military projections of both were committed
I should argue, to a collision course. When reading the letters from this period along with Dorr's opponents, you really get a sense that they felt as if they were standing in the center of a windstorm as the currents of history swept past them. By mid-May, Dorr let it be known that he had lost all patience with the moderates who were still hoping for reconciliation. As dusk turned to dark on May 17, 1842, the residents of Providence, Rhode Island were returning to their homes, but few were preparing for a restful night's sleep. Citizens were on edge, expecting the sound of cannon fire at any moment. The shops and banks had been closed all day. The city's cobblestone streets were filled with men in uniform, from young recruits engaged in their first military drills to more senior militiamen who might have performed a similar duty a decade earlier when the city was beset by a multi-day race riot that left 4 dead. At first, it was mere rumor and speculation, but as the night wore on, credible witnesses reported that the people's governor was planning an assault on the arsenal on the west side of the city. If this was indeed to be his final battle, Dorr looked like he wanted to go out with a bang. The moment reached a crescendo in the early morning hours of May 18th. Commentators frequently referred to the state of civil commotion. Now, that commotion looked like all-out war as Dorr and his band of devoted followers threatened violence. Providence militiaman William Bailey was convinced that Dorr was motivated only by malice and revenge. William Bailey's papers, I should point out, are the Rhode Island Historical Society. Dorr's goal, according to Bailey, was to destroy lives and property. Not taking any chances, Bailey hired a carriage to take his wife and young son out of the city. He remarked to friends that he felt it was indeed the height of the French Revolution happening right there in Providence. Rumors circulated that after he captured the arsenal, Dorr intended to march east across the city to Brown University in order to use the dormitories as barracks for the troops. From there, Dorr would order his men to seize public and private property and redistribute it among the poor masses, establishing an agrarian despotism. Dorr, of course, had no intention of doing that. But the rumors were powerful. At 2 o'clock in the morning on May 18th, alarm bells and the cry of fire began to arouse Providence's sleeping inhabitants. Perhaps Dorr, I always wondered, might have recognized the sound atop St. John's Episcopal Church, where his family owned a pew. With street lamps veiled by a heavy fog rising from Narragansett Bay, Dorr's men used torches to light their way. Providence elites living in the large homes on the hills of the east side, certainly Dorr's parents among them, saw a long column of flickering lights marching off. Lydia Dorr likely watched with trepidation as her own husband went off to defend the city, and her other son, Sullivan Jr., went to join her brothers in the arsenal. Lydia's family was literally coming apart at the seams and bringing the city with it. 70 of Dorr's men had successfully stolen 2 60-pound cannons in broad daylight, 60-pound cannons, in broad daylight from the United Train of Artillery in Providence the day before. He now intended to make use of them. If Dorr's men had dragged the cannon directly to the arsenal, they probably could have taken it without a fight. The arsenal, a 50 by 60-foot structure with chipstone walls, was constructed to withstand shot and shell, but its thatched roof could easily be blown off, or worse, ignited, burning those inside. King called for additional reinforcements from the conservative coastal enclaves of Warren, Bristol, and Newport. King went to the arsenal himself to encourage his men to stand their ground. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, Dorr's men set up an encampment within musket shot of the northeast wall of the building. It can't be possible that your brother intends to fire on this building when he knows that you, his father, and his uncles are all in it, asked a Providence militiaman of Sullivan Jr., who was looking out a window of the arsenal at his older brother in the darkness. I guess you are not acquainted with the breed, young Sullivan was said to have replied. Though Dorr had to make a decision. His numbers were dwindling in the early morning hours. He decided, rather than assault, it was expedient to fire first with the cannon shot. The plan was sound, except for one important detail. His men had failed to properly cover the cannon when it started to rain. The damp wicks would not light. When the cannons failed to ignite, the rest of Dorr's men fled into the night. The people's governor soon followed. His uncle eventually helped him escape the city. Let me read to you from a headline from the New York Herald. Killed 0, wounded 0, missing 481, scared 960, horribly frightened 789, fainted on the battleground 73, women in hysterics 22, temperance pledge broken before the battle 330, governors missing 1. But the seriousness of the issue remained. Dorr would travel to New York, and he would come back, as you might well know, in June of 1842. Martial law remained in place. Many of Dorr's followers were rounded up and thrown in jail, wallowing in prison eventually throughout the summer. Let me read to you from a letter from William Lloyd Garrison, the famed abolitionist in Boston, who was married to a Rhode Islander. What a horrible state of things exists in Rhode Island. What calamity can be more unendurable to a free people than to be placed under the absolute despotism of martial law, wrote Garrison. With the suffrage party, I have very little sympathy. Garrison here was referring to the white-only clause that made it into the People's Constitution against Dorr's wishes. While they protest against a land-holding aristocracy, they basically exclude by their constitution all colored citizens from voting at the polls. But, said Garrison, I still have less sympathy with the Charter Party. Dorr eventually would flee again after a fiasco in Chaput, this time to New Hampshire. He lived actually out in the open with the governor, a man named Henry Hubbard, a Democrat. He walked the streets, became friendly with a future president in Concord, a man named Franklin Pierce. He would eventually come back to the state, actually in around Halloween of 1843, where he would give himself up for arrest in Providence. In the meantime, the state had pushed ahead with a new constitution when Dorr was in his exile period. Another one to be debated, and this one went into effect. Although it eased suffrage requirements, the reformed constitution that was produced in the wake of Dorr's rebellion was a far cry from Dorr's original vision. It mandated a 1-year residency requirement for freeholders, a 2-year residency requirement for the native born without real estate, but owning $134 worth of personal property. Naturalized citizens were still required to own $134 worth of real estate. Democrat Elijah Potter Jr. noted in a letter to former Governor Francis that the Law and Order Party would rather have African Americans vote than the damn Irish. When the Constitution was put before the state, all citizens who were to be admitted to the franchise under the new suffrage requirements were allowed to vote, and the Constitution was indeed approved by a lopsided margin, with most of Dorr's followers abstaining from voting. And a provision on black suffrage passed quite overwhelmingly, actually a 2-to-1 margin. Rhode Island, on a side note, became the first state to, through the state legislature and a constitutional change, to grant suffrage to African Americans after previously removing it by statute, and that had been done in 1822, and then it was brought back in the wake of Dorr's rebellion. Even Dorr, the ardent anti-slavery Whig politician in the 1830s, before he switched to the Democrats, and a friend of African Americans and African American suffrage, complained later that naturalized citizens are not allowed to vote, while African Americans are on the same basis of native whites. So once again, where I began the talk tonight, Dorr returned. He stood trial for treason. He was convicted of treason, the first man to be convicted of treason against the state. You might know the name of the second. That's the murdering abolitionist John Brown in 1859, convicted of treason against the state of Virginia. On screen is Dorr's prison number, where he was sent to the state prison, which is roughly where the Providence Place Mall is now, give or take. And during his time in prison, he painted these beautiful hand fans that have survived. While he was in prison, his father, behind the scenes, working with Newport resident Richard Randolph, tried to get his son released. Sullivan Dorr sent a confidential letter and petition to now Speaker of the House, Richard Randolph. He said this: "I do not mean to justify my unhappy son, but I pray that a man of letters should not be caged with the lowest felons," wrote Sullivan, who also hinted that there was something mentally wrong with his oldest son. Randolph replied 4 days later, stating that he had visited Dorr in jail. Randolph showed Dorr his father's petition and recommended that he take an oath of allegiance to the present state government in order to secure a release. The idealistic Dorr refused to compromise. According to Randolph, Dorr considered himself a martyr to an important principle. It wasn't possible to help one, he told his dad, who was not willing to help himself. Dorr, though, would eventually be released in the year 1845, spending roughly 1 year in Providence, several more months on top of that in a prison in Newport. And indeed, he would live out the rest of his years in Providence, passing away in December of 1854 at his home. So here's something to think about that I often like to talk with my students, and when I have a chance to engage with them about the Dorr Rebellion. The story of the Dorr Rebellion represents a constitutional question of really great moment, I think, for Americans before the Civil War. The question was simple: who were the rightful monitors of the constitutional order? Today, many take it for granted that that function falls to the U.S. Supreme Court, but that question was far from clear for Americans of an earlier generation. For them, it seemed quite plausible that the court, Congress, and the executive each had roles, and what their interrelationship was remained uncertain. And of course, even more outside of our modern understanding, but clearly compelling to many Americans, was the possibility of a role of the people, however one conceived them, as a check on unconstitutional actions of government. There was a legacy here of the American Revolution playing out in Rhode Island. This question of the sovereignty of the people. Hot button issues of Jacksonian America fully on display. Democracy, race, nativism, and issues of gender. That actually a new addition to the Dorr website deals with Dorrite women. The threats of Dorrism, I should say too, lived on in the minds of many conservatives in Rhode Island long after Dorr's rebellion was halted on the hills of Chaput in northern part of the state. Let me just get into the 1850s just quickly. The Providence Journal commented on the danger of eliminating suffrage restrictions. This is a decade after the rebellion. Rhode Island will no longer be Rhode Island when it's done. It will become a province of Ireland. St. Patrick will take the place of Roger Williams, and the Shamrock will supersede the Anchor and Hope. That's from the Journal from 1851. If a Dorrite ticket emerged victorious that year, an election ticket, warned the Journal, the restriction of a landed qualification for foreigners to vote under our present Constitution is to be done away with, and a whole army of Irish Catholic voters are to let in to vote down Native American citizens of Rhode Island. The anti-Catholic sentiment bubbled over with the election of Philip Allen, Thomas Dorr's uncle. Allen's followers represented the liberal urban branch of the state's Democratic Party. The Journal noted that the question to consider and decide in the election was, should the ballot box be surrendered forever to the guardianship of Catholic Jesuit priests and the protection of the Irish peasants? Warning against the threat of Dorrism in the upcoming election, the Journal maintained that if suffrage reform was enacted, the ship of state will be launched upon a voyage from which there was no return, to which there was no port of safety. Make these changes to our fundamental law, and everything conservative is afloat. The changes that the editors of the Journal so feared were the abolition of the dollar tax, the abolition of the open ballot, and the admission of naturalized foreigners to vote on equal terms with native citizens. Revision of the 1843 Constitution was a central political debate at multiple points in the 1850s in Rhode Island. The editors of the Boston Times observed that substantially the parties are fighting on the same ground in the 1850s that they had held a decade before. Ever since that time, the same contest again and again and again had been happening in Rhode Island, said the editors of the Boston Times. A referendum introduced in 1853 to ease suffrage restrictions was resoundingly defeated by the Whig-dominated legislature, which was moving steadily towards the position of a party known as the Know Nothing Party. In 1855 and 1856, the American Party in Rhode Island formed a coalition with the Whigs and elected a man named William Hoppin to the governorship. In the wake of this and into the Civil War and beyond, a very important reformer named Charles Gorman continued the fight. And I encourage you, I want to be able to stop now to take some questions. But Bob Heyman, who's on this call, has done a tremendous amount of work on Charles Gorman to really extend the story into the later part of the 19th century and what Gorman was trying to do, and still indeed battling against the Providence Journal. Even though the 1888 Bourne Amendment removed many of the anti-democratic provisions of the 1843 Constitution that was in the wake of Dorr, there was still a clause requiring ownership of $134 of real or personal property for voting on financial questions and in most city elections. So it gives you some sense of how long this goes on. So I'm going to stop there. I want to make sure that I can have time for a robust conversation. So I thank you for your time. And I'm going to open up the chat feature and to see what I can do to answer a few that may be in there. Scroll down a little bit. Okay, first question here. I've heard that both sides of the rebellion looked to Fort Adams for support. Dorr sought the support of the Irish laborers, and King appealed to the U.S. Army. Is there any evidence of this? This is from Steve, referring again to Fort Adams. Yes, the short answer is yes. Early on, there is evidence of this. I talk a little bit about it in my book. My friend Russell DeSimone, who lives in Middletown, I don't think he's on the call with us here tonight, but he's written a little bit about kind of the politics, if you will, dealing with the fort. It, without question, comes up quite a bit in some of the debates between King and key officials in John Tyler's administration, including Daniel Webster. It, of course, in the end, is no bastion of support in terms of troops that are going to be housed there for Thomas Dorr. It's going to be a powerful, say, pro-charter position in terms of troops coming. Question from Roger Sullivan, excuse me. Why was Dorr released in 1845 after only 3 years in prison? Great question. I wish I had a little bit more time. I would go into this a little bit more. So basically what happened is that there were many conservatives in the state. When Dorr returned, there could be some parallels maybe to where we are right now as a country. Did not want to put Dorr on trial. They said, John Brown Francis among them, said that to do so would be to give Dorr another platform and perhaps give ammunition to the Democratic Party. And Francis was right, exactly right on that. Dorr's trial, of course, obviously he's convicted and goes to prison. His imprisonment, in particular in the year 1844, becomes a key issue in the presidential election. Indeed, in the North, what you see, the tagline of the Democratic Party is Polk Dallas, that's Alexander Dallas, Polk's vice presidential candidate, and Dorr broadcasted. Dorr's imprisonment was used quite skillfully by the Democrats to bolster their cause in that particular election. This was a pivotal election, actually, in American history. Polk would win, would beat Henry Clay, extremely close election. And the politics, if you will, of the Dorr Rebellion and Dorr's imprisonment had a lot to do with that. Also, I think eventually, because of the efforts of his father and Sullivan, there's an agreement, and Dorr is released the next year in 1845. But as I said, some conservatives knew that this was coming, but they plowed ahead with it, the trial, the imprisonment, and they really fed into the Democratic side. They could have taken a page out of the, or learned a little bit from Massachusetts. Marcus Morton from Taunton skillfully used the Dorr Rebellion to his own advantage to beat John Davis for the governorship of Massachusetts. And so the conservatives in Rhode Island really should have been paying attention to how the Dorr Rebellion sometimes played out in politics. But they fed it one more time in 1844, and it hurt the Whig cause quite substantially in that presidential election. So Henry Clay did not win. Consequential, because with Polk, you get an expansionist, and indeed you get the Mexican-American War that would, without question, the result of that war would set the country on a course to a civil war. Just scroll back up here and see if I can keep up with them. Question here from Joyce Patello. Could you speak a bit about the role of women in the Dorr Rebellion? Absolutely. Once again, I'll in just a moment here, I will put into the chat feature of Zoom some of the stuff that we've done on the Dorr Rebellion Project website. In recent years, we've added Dorr's prison correspondence with his mother, Lydia. He actually wrote on scraps of paper that were smuggled out, most likely by a woman named Catherine Williams. She was one of Dorr's closest friends to the day that he died. And but many women became connected to the Dorr Rebellion. It's actually a quite remarkable moment. These were Democratic women, self-identified as Democrats. A lot of times when you're studying women in the antebellum period, they tend to be abolitionists and they tend to lean to the Whig side. Often their husbands may be Whigs, but this was a different group politically in terms of their affiliation, for sure. And most of them, once again, not abolitionists. When Dorr's followers were wallowing in prison, women kept the cause alive. They actually helped in a tremendous way Marcus Morton win the governorship in Massachusetts. They put on large clam bakes. People came, they kept Dorr's memory alive. They visited him in New Hampshire. They were the ones who called a lot of times for abstaining of voting in the fall of 1842 for that constitution I mentioned. We call it the 1843 Constitution because it went into effect the following year. But they were really connected. And Dorr himself acknowledged this. He kept up an active correspondence. There was a Dorr Liberation Society headed by women. They were very fiery. They gave speeches. Anne Parlin, perhaps the most fiery of them all. She was connected to some labor reformers in New York. If you ever seen the movie Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese, will give you some, I think, a sense of what that group might have been like. And Dorr himself was connected to them a little bit too. He was protected by labor radicals in New York in May and June of 1842. A man named Levi Slam. So women, significant role to play. And I do tell quite a bit about this story in my book. It was, without question, I think, an underappreciated aspect of the rebellion in previous accounts. I really wanted to make sure that I dove into this, and not only looking at women who supported Dorr, but those that were absolutely against him. Thank you, Joyce, for that great question. All right, I'm just reading something here from Dan Titus. The Newport Artillery, a state militia unit, says to this day that they won the right of the line by going up to Providence and marching on Dorr's troops. I have to go back and check my records. I do think that is correct in terms of, I have to go back and check my files on the Providence Journal, but I do think that is correct. Of course, now the journal was not digitized when I was looking at doing this, so I spent many years losing my eyesight on microfilm. But my recollection is that is indeed correct. Larry Davis, a question about land ownership come into play for instance. So that the year there is 1798. So the figure itself is, you're correct, Larry, was not set in the charter. Was set in 1798 at $134, but you are correct. It's not in the original charter. It's in 1798. Question from Dr. Quinn. So if there had been no Dorr Rebellion, would the Irish immigrants have gotten the vote earlier? Great question, Dr. Quinn. I doubt it myself. I think that the interesting question there, if I can just invert it a little bit, is the question, if there was no Dorr Rebellion, would African Americans have been brought into the political process as they were with a, in the fall of 1842 and being enshrined in that Constitution? That to me is always one of the most interesting stories of the rebellion. Dorr himself as an anti-slavery advocate, member executive committee of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society, abolitionists looked to Dorr when he was writing the People's Constitution to bring them into the fold. There was an expectation that he would, and for right reasons. And Dorr did believe in it, but he was outvoted. Actually, it was the Newport attorney, Duty Pierce, who was adamant about keeping African Americans out. So the white only clause gets inserted. And actually, it's Duty Pierce who really you can pinpoint for that. And from that moment, Dorr faced severe backlash from the abolitionists in New England, those that he considered to be friends. And Garrison in particular went after him pretty hard in the Liberator, and Dorr never forgot that. He was stung by that. He felt that he had worked hard for it and was outvoted, but he had promised that he would do his best to, if the People's Constitution got in, he was governor, that he would then correct it. But there were actually abolitionists descended upon Rhode Island, including a very young Frederick Douglass, to protest against the People's Constitution in 6 kind of conventions, if you will, sponsored by the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society in December of 1841. This is a very young Douglass. It's actually one of Frederick Douglass's first major kind of speaking engagements in his career. Obviously would blossom after that. Was Dorr, a question from Peter, I apologize, I don't know your last name, Peter, whether Dorr served in prison, was he in prison with Gordon? The answer to that is yes. And he did hear and commented in a letter to his mother that is on the Dorr Rebellion Project website about the priest that came in to read the last, or administer, excuse me, the last rites to Gordon. Dorr believed that Gordon was innocent. He said as such to his mother. And he could most from his cell he couldn't see what was happening, but he did comment that he knew that the gallows had been constructed the day before and had heard the commotion around it. So he was indeed there. And you have to think, obviously, if you're serving in that prison, that here he is convicted of treason, that he could have faced that himself. And how lucky he was that he did not. Question from Carol Sullivan along the same lines. Conditions in the prison when Dorr was incarcerated. So we do have quite a bit of that information in terms of gathering actually from Dorr's own letters to his mother, where he commented quite a bit about what he was enduring. Food. He suffered from a variety of health issues, so he often talked about that. He talked quite openly about the warden and the treatment he was receiving. He complained at times when they took away a candle. He wasn't supposed to write or communicate. The letters to his mother were smuggled out, actually were quite difficult to transcribe because Dorr was literally writing on any scrap of paper he could find under poor light. He actually had quite good penmanship, but you could tell he was doing this in a rush often. We do not sadly have the letters back. He probably, for security, destroyed every time a letter was smuggled into him from his mother. He probably burned it. But we do have what he sent out because she saved it all. And it does give us a good picture, a good sense of life in the prison at that point. It's a very actually unique glimpse. There are a few artistic drawings that were done that have showed up in periodicals at the time. And we do know he was prisoner number 56, and that he actually, that badge is at the John Hay Library. That's why I had that image up before. Oh, that's Representative Martin. Very nice to have you on board here. So I think I got through most of the questions. I should point out too that I believe Representative Martin was on that same podcast that I was on a few weeks ago. I think he was on part 2. I had the pleasure to be on part 1. That was all relating to the Gordon trial. And I can't say enough too for those on the call that Father Heeman has written a multi-volume history of the diocese. That is really a grand history, really, of the state, and it's very important. And I do hope that maybe Ian could figure a way to get that information out. Those are volumes that any student of the state should have. Father Heeman's books, he's of course written articles in Rhode Island history. And you can download those articles now right off of the website itself. Let me get one more here. This is Ian's sending me something from someone who's having a little bit of trouble with the chat. Was it common for Rhode Islanders to name their children in honor of Dorr during this era? Probably not. On Dorr's, at least the class of people that hung out with Sullivan and Lydia, I can't imagine that. We sadly do not have. So early on in Dorr's collection, you will come across letters from Dorr to his family, including his siblings. Only one or two, if I remember correctly, to his sisters. His sisters were married to individuals, including one, Samuel Ames, the state's who had a position within the state government, whose job it was to track Dorr down. His other sister was married to Edward Carrington Jr. So I think Dorr was without question the black sheep. He was cared for by his mother. His health was kind of broken by his time in prison. He was never in perfect health by any stretch of the imagination. If you can believe some of the letters from his father at the time he was in prison, that he might have been mentally ill. Though there is no real evidence of that prior to his time in prison. And I've always believed that Dorr's, father loved him and that was trying to get him out. And I think without question, the politics surrounding the Gordon trial, and then of course, Gordon's execution, probably scared Sullivan. He didn't want to lose his son. And he worked behind the scenes with Richard Randolph. Eventually that was successful. And there was also a movement called the Dorr Liberation Society to get him out. But I've never seen Dorr didn't have children of his own, but his sisters did. And they were not necessarily paying homage to Uncle Tommy, if you will.
Well, Eric, we're a little bit after 7 now. So I think we probably want to stop unless you have any more, see any more questions coming in your chat box.
John, there's one question from Father Heyman, an additional question that I just forwarded to Eric. It ended up in my chat, but Eric should see it now.
Okay,
the issue of suffrage in the foreign-born.
I'm just not seeing it yet.
Yeah, I'll read it if that's okay.
Here we go. I found it. Sorry.
You got it? Oh, yep. Good. Great.
All right, this is from Father Heyman. The issue of suffrage for the foreign-born came up in the Constitutional Convention held in Newport. The issue prompted speakers to greatly exaggerate the number of Irish in Newport. Many of the Newport laborers left the state. The issue was continued by their Irish and Native American in the Suffrage Association. Can you comment on that association? So for the, I think what Father Heyman is getting as the Rhode Island Suffrage Association was an interesting group that was formed in the later part of 1840 into 41. And Dorr was kind of a latecomer. He had actually just was in the process in 1839-40 of switching his political affiliation from Whig to Democrat. This group started without him. He comes into it, emerges, kind of goes up the ranks, if you will. They're actually kind of writing letters to him early on saying, come and join us. And he's a little bit hesitant. He's had his own profitable legal practice in Providence. And had an unsuccessful bid for Congress, but was looking again to try again. He was switching parties, seeing if he could become a more prominent Democrat. And certainly, he had the backing of his dad. He had money, and I think he was a little bit apprehensive at first of joining the suffrage association. They woo him over. Interesting mix of individuals in that group, as Father Heyman mentions. You have workers, laborers, without question. Irish early on, I think, are indeed there. African Americans are there. Abolitionists are there. It's an interesting group, for sure. Women are extremely active in it. Now, as you get later in 1841, when things get a little serious, you're moving from the stance of a parade to a gathering, and then you enter into a period of writing a constitution without the authority. And then what do you do with that? And that's when you see numbers kind of begin to peel. People get a little bit nervous for obvious reasons. Who's going to push ahead with this? Do we have the authority to? Are we committing treason? And indeed, the Rhode Island General Assembly would pass a statute along those lines in the spring of 42. This is a very serious issue.
Well, okay, Eric. Well, maybe we'll stop there. Thanks very much for such an interesting and informative talk, and fielding all of our questions in the chat box. So we appreciate you being with us. Thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure, John. Thank you once again for that very kind introduction. Again, it was wonderful to see you. Thank you to Anne for this, making tonight happen. I'm just putting a couple of links in the chat. Something I had mentioned before is an article I wrote with my good friend Russell D. Simone on the race issue a few years ago, an online journal called Commonplace, sponsored by the American Antiquarian Society. And here's a link to the Dorr Rebellion Project website. Some wonderful information. As John mentioned, this is sponsored by Providence College. It's free, it's open access. So here's, if you want to view the constitutions out there, you can do that. And I'll put a direct link just now, the third link I will insert, where you can see all of these letter collections that we've uploaded. These are digitized and transcribed with questions. They're all geared at classroom use for students and teachers. But if you have any young people at home that are interested in Rhode Island history, please share this link. We want to see it used, and we want to see it used in the classroom. And once again, the two most recent additions are in Dorr's prison correspondence with his mother, Lydia, and Dorite Women, which we were thankful for a partnership with John Hay Library to make that happen.